Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she uncovers a secret hidden inside something heartbreakingly ordinary. An old photograph torn not once, but twice. The first tear was out of anger, the second out of fear. But when the pieces are placed together, they reveal a face no one was supposed to remember, and a crime no one was meant to see. Stay with me till the end, because the picture may be damaged, but the truth behind it remains perfectly clear. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's mystery is worth every second. Until the very end. Chapter 1. The garden party on a golden September afternoon. The lawn behind the Weatherby's grand, ivy-covered house was sprinkled with tables bearing china cups and dainty sandwiches, the scent of late roses drifting on a mild breeze. The occasion was Mrs. Weatherby's annual garden party, a tradition in the village of St. Aldred's, and the entire social fabric of the place seemed to be gathered there. Vicar's wife in a pale straw hat, the postmistress with her brisk laughter, young women in floral dresses, and elderly gentlemen shifting in wicker chairs with the air of men enduring the fuss. For the sake of the cakes, Miss Jane Marple sat near the edge of the lawn, her back straight and her pale blue eyes quietly observing. A slice of seed cake lay untouched on her plate, for her attention was elsewhere on the way Mrs. Helena Pritchard was frowning slightly at her teacup, on the curious manner in which young Simon Dunning avoided looking at the rector's niece, and on the fact that Mrs. Weatherby's smile, though radiant, faltered whenever her husband's name was mentioned. These were the small things other people missed, but Miss Marple had learned over many years that it was the small things which often mattered most. The talk was light at first about the harvest fair, about a shortage of decent lace at the haberdasher's, about the upcoming parish concert, but it shifted when Mrs. Weatherby, in a slightly hushed voice, began showing a photograph she had found in one of the drawers in the study. "It's from years ago," she said with a little laugh. "Quite faded, I'm afraid, but I can't imagine why it was tucked away." The photograph made its way from hand to hand, provoking mild curiosity until it reached Miss Marple. It was an old snapshot, the kind taken with a box camera, 3 figures standing in front of a country inn, all smiling in the sunlight. But there was something odd. The image had been torn neatly in two and then clumsily mended with a strip of yellowing tape. A second tear crossed it diagonally, as though someone had changed their mind twice about destroying it. Miss Marple studied the faces without appearing to do so. Two were instantly recognizable: Mr. Weatherby himself, much younger, and Mrs. Helena Pritchard. The third, a tall man in a dark suit, was unfamiliar to her. His smile was charming, but there was a guardedness in the eyes. "Where did you find it?" asked Mrs. Carpenter, leaning over. "In the bureau in the study," Mrs. Weatherby replied, too casually. "I must have put it there myself ages ago." A faint strain passed through her voice. Miss Marple filed it away without comment. The photograph had scarcely completed its circuit before the air changed. Not abruptly, but with that subtle shift one feels before a storm. Mrs. Pritchard rose suddenly, muttering something about a headache. Simon Dunning disappeared toward the orchard, and Mrs. Weatherby, noticing the absence of her husband, went pale. It was less than half an hour later when the scream came from the side of the house, sharp enough to make every head turn. Several guests ran toward it. Miss Marple did not run, but she was among the first to arrive. Weatherby lay on the gravel path near the greenhouse, quite still, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. A teacup lay smashed beside him, its contents seeping into the earth. Mrs. Weatherby stood nearby, her gloved hands trembling. eyes wide with something between shock and terror. She began, but her voice failed. Someone called for Dr. Penberry, others for the police. The hum of polite conversation had vanished, replaced by a low murmur of disbelief and fear. Even in that moment, Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the house, to the table where the torn photograph still lay under a paperweight. In her experience, photographs, especially ones someone had tried twice to destroy, were rarely harmless keepsakes. She did not yet know who had killed Lawrence Weatherby, nor why, but she felt, with the quiet certainty born of long acquaintance with human folly, that the answer would be found somewhere between the shadows in that picture and the secrets no one at the party had yet dared to speak. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The following morning, St. Aldred's was humming like a disturbed beehive. The murder or accident, as some preferred to call it, though their eyes suggested otherwise, had already woven itself into every cup of tea, every whispered exchange in the village shop, and every cautious nod over hedges. The church bells rang as they always did, but the sound seemed sharper, somehow. In the brittle air of suspicion, Miss Marple, making her way to the high street for her customary errands, passed Mrs. Lorimer leaning heavily on her gate, pretending to prune roses while keeping an ear turned to the conversation drifting from the milk delivery cart. Even the grocer's boy, who normally whistled as he carried baskets to the back door of the vicarage, moved more quietly, as though the weight of the previous day's shock had taken hold of the very cobblestones. In the small post office, where letters were collected with the same care as pearls, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was recounting again the moment she heard about the dreadful thing. She claimed she had been in the middle of arranging the postcards when young Emma Croft burst in, breathless, saying that Mr. Weatherby had been found lying stone dead by the greenhouse. "And I always said," Mrs. Price concluded in a lowered tone, "that man had secrets. Mark my words, secrets come to light sooner or later." She glanced at Miss Marple as she spoke, perhaps expecting agreement, but Miss Marple merely nodded mildly, her face unreadable, her gloved hands busy with the stamps she had come to purchase. At the far corner of the counter, Mr. Fletcher, the retired schoolmaster, was certain the death was nothing more than an unfortunate fall. "Gravel paths are treacherous," he declared, "especially in shoes with slick soles. One mustn't be melodramatic." His voice carried the confidence of one who believed himself above village hysteria, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze darted toward Mrs. Pritchard's name when it arose in the conversation, as though he, too, had filed away certain thoughts for later consideration. Meanwhile, at the Blue Hart Inn, the morning coffee regulars had gathered in the low-beamed parlor to sift through rumors, like flour through a sieve. Simon Denning's name surfaced more than once, for he had been seen heading toward the orchard shortly before the scream. There was also murmuring about Mrs. Weatherby's reaction, whether her shock had been genuine, or perhaps the delayed performance of someone whose mind was already turning over what to say to the police. The torn photograph came up as well, though it was mentioned with the vague delicacy one reserves for something not entirely proper. "A man in a suit, never seen him before," muttered old Mr. Kilburn, who claimed to have caught a glimpse of it. "And why tear it twice, eh? Once isn't enough." Inspector Graves from the county constabulary arrived before midday, a tall man with a bristling mustache and the kind of politeness that concealed impatience. He interviewed those who had been at the garden party, taking notes with brisk strokes of his pencil. Miss Marple watched from her seat in the Weatherby's morning room as the guests of the previous day filed in and out, each emerging with an expression that suggested they had either been unfairly suspected or insufficiently believed. Graves questioned Mrs. Weatherby at length, but if he drew any conclusions, he did not share them. He seemed most interested in whether anyone had seen Mr. Weatherby take his tea from a particular pot, and whether any quarrels had been overheard during the afternoon. Helena Pritchard, pale but composed, admitted she had left the lawn before the scream, claiming she had a headache. "I simply went upstairs to lie down," she said. Her voice was steady, yet her gloved hands rested tightly on her lap. Miss Marple, from her quiet place by the window, observed the subtle tremor in Helena's left thumb, a movement most people would have overlooked. It was not fear, precisely it was tension, as though she were rehearsing a scene in her mind and trying to keep the lines straight. Later, when the inspector had gone to confer with the constable outside, Mrs. Weatherby entered carrying a tray of tea, her manner polite but distant. She glanced once toward the bureau in the corner, the same bureau from which the photograph had emerged, and her eyes lingered just a fraction too long. Miss Marple noted it in silence. She did not need to examine the bureau herself. She already suspected that it contained more than a single old picture worth tearing. By mid-afternoon, the lanes were full of walkers with no real errands. A person might pass the vicarage 3 times in an hour by chance, or find urgent reason to buy peppermints from the shop, simply to overhear what Mrs. Price had heard from Mrs. Chudla, who had it on good authority from her cousin that the police had found something near the greenhouse. Miss Marple moved among them unobtrusively, absorbing the conflicting versions. In her experience, the first waves of gossip were like paint thrown onto a wall, messy, unreliable, but telling in their choice of colors. That evening, she sat by her parlor fire with her knitting, reviewing the day's impressions. The village, she thought, was leaning toward two suspects, Simon Dunning, for his sudden disappearance from the lawn, and Helena Pritchard, for reasons no one would name openly. But Miss Marple was already inclined to doubt both. The real key, she suspected, lay not in who had been seen near the greenhouse, but in the peculiar history behind a torn photograph, and the way it had unsettled 3 different people in 3 different ways. The trouble was that history had yet to be spoken aloud. Outside, the wind rose faintly, carrying with it the sound of footsteps on the lane. Miss Marple listened without turning her head, hearing the measured pace slow near her gate before continuing on. Whoever it was, they had paused just long enough to look toward her house. A harmless passerby, perhaps or perhaps not. She returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly, her mind turning over the threads of human nature that, she knew, would soon begin to unravel in earnest. Chapter 3. Early investigation. Next morning brought a thin mist over St. Aldred's, softening the edges of the cottages and turning the church spire into a pale silhouette. Inspector Graves was back before most villagers had finished their breakfast, his motor car parked squarely in front of the Weatherby's gate, as if to remind everyone of his authority. Miss Marple, however, did not call upon the Weatherbys immediately. She preferred to let the first rush of official questioning run its course, knowing that in the bustle of it, people often revealed more to one another than they would ever say to the police. She walked instead toward the greengrocer's, basket in hand, pausing here and there to exchange a remark about the weather or to admire a bed of chrysanthemums. The village was alive with talk, but the tone had shifted. Yesterday's shocked whispers had begun to take on a more definite shape, the beginnings of theories clothed in certainty. Mrs. Chudla told anyone who would listen that Mr. Weatherby had been overly friendly with a certain woman in the village. Though she never specified who, Mr. Kilburn repeated his opinion about the torn photograph, declaring it a clear sign of a quarrel from years past. By the time Miss Marple returned home with her purchases, a note had been pushed under her door. It was written in a hurried hand, unsigned. "I must speak with you. Urgent. Not here." There was a place and time, 3 o'clock, at the old footbridge over the mill stream. Miss Marple tucked it into her sewing basket without altering her expression. She had no doubt the message would come from someone who did not wish to be seen confiding in the police, whether their urgency was driven by fear, guilt, or curiosity remained to be discovered. At the Weatherby house, Inspector Graves was making his way through the staff. The parlor maid, Alice, said she had seen Mr. Weatherby step away from the tea table to speak with Simon Dunning near the shrubbery, but she hadn't heard their words. The gardener, a slow-spoken man named Harris, claimed he had been at the far end of the kitchen garden all afternoon. Graves pressed him on whether he'd seen anyone near the greenhouse before the scream, but Harris only shook his head and muttered something about keeping to my lettuce. Miss Marple, who had entered quietly with a jar of her quince jelly under the pretext of calling on Mrs. Weatherby, caught a glint in Harris's eyes that did not match his placid tone. She let it pass for now, content to store it away. Mrs. Weatherby received her in the morning room, looking pale but composed. The photograph was no longer on the side table. When Miss Marple inquired after it in the mild, almost distracted way that had fooled so many before, Mrs. Weatherby hesitated a fraction too long before saying she had put it away safely. She did not say where, nor did she seem inclined to discuss why it had been torn in the first place. Instead, she spoke of her husband's fondness for the garden, how he had planned to enter a rose in next year's flower show, and how strange it seemed that he should be gone so suddenly. But beneath the measured words, Miss Marple detected the strain of a woman whose mind was preoccupied with something she could not say aloud. By the time Miss Marple reached the footbridge that afternoon, the mist had burned away, leaving the stream bright and quick under the low sun. A figure was already waiting Helena Pritchard, her posture taut, gloved hands clasped tightly. "I couldn't go to the police," Helena began without preamble. "They'd think I was inventing it. But I heard something just before the scream." She glanced about as though the reeds might be listening. It was Lawrence's voice, and he sounded angry. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. And then there was another voice, slower, calmer. "I can't be certain whose." Miss Marple listened without interrupting, though Helena's eyes flickered once when she spoke of the second voice, as though it stirred an unwelcome recognition. "Did you see anyone?" Miss Marple asked gently. Helena shook her head. "Only the shadow on the greenhouse glass. It could have been anyone." Her gaze drifted toward the village, and when she left, it was with the air of someone who had given away more than she intended. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the greenhouse. The constable on duty, young and deferential, allowed her to pass when she explained she was looking for her knitting bag from the party. The place was empty, the air damp and heavy with the scent of soil. A single overturned pot lay near the door, its spill of earth scattered in a neat arc, as though it had been moved deliberately rather than knocked over in haste. More curious still was a faint mark in the dust along the bench's straight line, thin and precise, as if made by the edge of a photograph. As she stepped out into the fading light, she saw Simon Dunning crossing the orchard. He raised a hand in greeting, but did not stop to speak. There was an uneasiness in his stride, a restless energy at odds with the quiet of the place. Miss Marple stood for a moment watching him go, her thoughts circling back to Helena's account of the low, calm voice. She was beginning to sense a pattern, though it was like the first faint outlines of embroidery before the colors were filled in. That night, sitting alone in her parlor, Miss Marple spread her knitting across her lap and reviewed the day. Someone in the village knew more than they dared to say. The torn photograph, the overheard tones of anger and calm, the missing object that might have lain in the greenhouse dust, they were threads, waiting to be drawn together. And Jane Marple, with her quiet patience, was content to wait for just the right tug to set the whole tapestry shifting. Chapter 4. First suspects. The following morning was bright but cold, the kind of autumn day when sunlight glances sharply off the windows of the cottages, and every sound seems to carry a little farther. By the time Miss Marple returned from her early walk, she could already hear the low, steady thrum of conversation drifting from the high street. The air in St. Aldred's had grown heavier, not with grief alone, but with the sense that the police were narrowing their view, and that those who might be in it would soon feel the heat of that focus. Inspector Graves, who had been lodging at the Blue Hart Inn during the inquiry, made no secret of the fact that two names were being discussed most keenly: Simon Dunning and Helena Pritchard. He did not announce it to the village, of course, but in a place as small as St. Aldred's, such matters required no proclamation. Simon's restless movements at the party, his conversation with Mr. Weatherby just before the scream, and his quick retreat into the orchard were being whereupon together into something resembling guilt. Helena, for her part, was linked by that strange tension she could not quite conceal, and by an undercurrent of old speculation that had followed her for years, a rumor, vague yet persistent, that she had once been at the center of a very different scandal far from St. Aldred's. Miss Marple, as was her way, did not rush to contradict these suspicions. She knew too well that to oppose gossip directly was to make it grow stronger. Instead, she listened, knitting in her parlor while Mrs. Lorimer sat by the fire recounting for the third time her theory that Simon had gone to confront Mr. Weatherby about money owed to him. According to Mrs. Lorimer, the orchard path was simply the most discreet route to the confrontation. When Miss Marple inquired mildly how Mrs. Lorimer had come by this notion, the lady admitted she had overheard Simon speaking sharply to the bank clerk 2 days earlier. One must piece things together, she said with a satisfied nod. As if the case were all but solved, Helena's situation was not helped by the arrival of her nephew, Paul Whiting, a tall, pale man with a dry, almost academic manner. He appeared unexpectedly at her cottage that afternoon, his arrival noted by more than one pair of eyes peering through lace curtains. Miss Marple, walking past on her way to the vicarage, saw Helena open the door to him with a look that was part relief, part unease. Paul stayed only a short while, but when he left, his face was set in an expression of cool determination, as though he had been given a task he did not particularly relish, but intended to complete nonetheless. Inspector Graves called on Miss Marple the next morning, ostensibly to gather background on village relationships, though his questions revealed a clear leaning toward one of his suspects. "This Dunning fellow, he's not quite respectable, is he?" Graves asked, watching her closely. Miss Marple adjusted a loop of wool on her needle, and replied that Simon Dunning was no better nor worse than any other young man, who had more charm than employment. It is often the case, she added gently, that charm is mistaken for deceit, and sometimes the other way round. Graves did not look convinced. That afternoon, she happened upon Simon himself in the lane behind the Weatherby house. He seemed eager to speak, though he began with a gruff sort of defensiveness. "I know what they're saying," he muttered, "but I didn't do anything. Weatherby asked me to meet him by the greenhouse, that's all. He said it was important, something about a piece of paper he'd found. I never got the chance to see it. When I arrived, he was still on the path, talking to someone else. I didn't want to interrupt, so I walked off toward the orchard. Then I heard the scream." His eyes shifted away as he said it, but there was a raw edge in his voice that sounded less like guilt than like frustration. Miss Marple thanked him kindly, as though he had merely given her the directions to the church. In truth, his words had caught her attention. A piece of paper. She thought of the faint mark she had noticed in the greenhouse dust, the size and shape that could easily match a photograph. If such a paper had been the subject of Weatherby's last conversation, then perhaps it had not been idle chance that the torn photograph had appeared at the party. The same afternoon, that evening, the police made a more formal approach to Helena Pritchard. She was seen walking with Inspector Graves along the lane, their conversation low and measured. Miss Marple, seated at her window, could not hear the words, but Helena's posture told its own story, upright at first, then slowly drawn inwards. as though the weight of the inspector's questions were pushing her back into herself. When they parted, Helena turned sharply toward her cottage without a glance at anyone watching. The village settled into uneasy quiet that night, though it was the kind of quiet in which every door latch and passing footstep seemed louder than usual. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the hearth, letting the fire's glow flicker against her knitting needles. She did not yet know the full nature of the secret binding these threads together, but she could feel its outline taking shape. It was there in the guarded exchanges, in the sudden arrival of Helena's nephew, in Simon's hurried explanation, and in the curious absence of a certain object that might explain the urgency of that final meeting by the greenhouse. She was not ready to voice her doubts to the inspector, for Graves was still moving along the well-worn path toward the obvious suspects. But Miss Marple knew that the obvious was often the enemy of the true. Somewhere in the polite silences of St. Aldred's lay the single detail that would turn the whole case inside out, and she, with her quiet patience and her talent for watching the smallest shifts in human behavior, meant to find it before anyone else. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. 2 days after Mr. Weatherby's death, a thin drizzle settled over St. Aldred's, giving the village the look of a watercolor left too long in the rain. The weather seemed to dampen the gossip only slightly. Instead of gathering in the street, people now spoke in shop doorways or under umbrellas, voices lowered but no less insistent. Inspector Graves continued his work with quiet determination, but Miss Marple could see from the way he carried himself that he believed the circle of suspects was tightening. She, however, was not so sure. There were threads dangling from the pattern he seemed to think complete, and it was precisely those threads that interested her most. That morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Weatherby house, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her damson jam to Mrs. Weatherby. She was shown into the morning room, where the curtains were half drawn against the wet day. Mrs. Weatherby received her with the careful politeness of someone who was growing tired of being scrutinized. The photograph was still absent from its place, and when Miss Marple's glance strayed toward the bureau, Mrs. Weatherby's eyes followed it for the briefest instant before she turned away. They spoke of small matters: the roses, the rain, the likelihood of a fine day for the harvest fair. But as Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by the window. "It's curious," she said softly, as though speaking to herself, "how the smallest things can go missing at the most inconvenient times." Mrs. Weatherby made no reply, but her fingers, which had been resting lightly on the arm of her chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was enough to confirm what Miss Marple already suspected. The photograph, or something very like it, had not been simply put away but removed for reasons that would not bear daylight later. In the high street, she encountered Harris the gardener, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet cobbles. She asked after his lettuce and, as if by chance, mentioned the greenhouse. Harris shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Police were poking about there again yesterday," he muttered. "Don't see what they expect to find now." But Miss Marple noticed the smudge of earth on his cuff, not fresh from that morning's work but dried, as though from handling something the day before and forgetting to brush it off. She let the observation rest in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, knowing the ripples would reach her in time. That afternoon, the drizzle eased, and Miss Marple took her knitting to the small arbor at the edge of her garden. From there she could see the lane, without being seen to clearly herself. Presently, she observed Simon Dunning passing by, glancing over his shoulder toward the Weatherby house before striding away in the opposite direction. A short while later, Helena Pritchard appeared, walking briskly, her head bent against the wind. She paused at the Weatherby's gate, as though deciding whether to enter, then moved on. It struck Miss Marple that both had come within sight of the house, without actually approaching it, behavior that suggested not indifference, but caution. In the early evening, Miss Marple received another note, slipped under her door as before. This one was briefer. The hand still hurried. "You were right. It matters. But it's gone now." There was no signature, no meeting place. She read it twice, her mind turning over the possibilities. What had been taken? The photograph seemed the obvious answer. But there was something about the phrasing "it matters" that suggested the object was more than a keepsake. It was a link, perhaps, between Mr. Weatherby's past and the moment of his death, the next morning. While the village still smelled faintly of damp earth from the rain, Miss Marple took a deliberate route that brought her past the back gate of the Weatherby property. There, half hidden in the hedge, she spotted a scrap of paper, soaked and crumpled. It might have been rubbish carried by the wind, but when she retrieved it and smoothed it gently, she saw the faint trace of photographic emulsion along one edge. The rest was blank, as though the image had been deliberately removed. She slipped it into her pocket without hesitation. It was not proof, at least, not yet, but it was the kind of small, stubborn clue that others might overlook and that she knew could grow in importance. With the right light upon it, that day, Inspector Graves held another round of interviews at the Blue Hart Inn. Miss Marple attended under the pretext of taking tea, but she listened closely as Simon's voice carried from the adjoining room. He repeated his claim about the meeting by the greenhouse, but there was a touch of weariness in it now, as though the repetition had begun to erode his certainty. Helena, when her turn came, was quieter than before, answering questions with measured calm. But Miss Marple noticed the same slight tremor in her left thumb that she had seen on the day of the party. Some tensions, she knew, did not vanish until the cause itself was removed. When evening came, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlor, the scrap of photo paper on the table beside her knitting basket. The truth of Mr. Weatherby's death was still obscured, but she felt herself drawing closer to it. The key, she was certain, lay in that torn image. What it had shown, why it had been destroyed and repaired, and who had decided it must disappear altogether. And as she watched the last embers in the great shift and glow, she thought that soon enough someone in St. Aldred's would betray themselves, not with a grand confession, but with some small, unguarded moment. And when they did, she would be ready. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Be the third day after Mr. Weatherby's death. The village had grown restless. The initial shock had given way to a taut, watchful atmosphere in which people moved about their routines, with eyes and ears tuned to catch the faintest hint of revelation. It was in such a climate that small slights and old grudges began to resurface, sharpened by the knowledge that a murder, if that was indeed what they were dealing with, was still among them. Miss Marple could sense the subtle shift in manner between neighbors who had known one another for decades. Greetings were shorter, glances lingered longer, and behind every polite exchange there seemed to be an unspoken question. Inspector Graves had increased his inquiries, moving beyond the immediate suspects to anyone who might have crossed paths with Mr. Weatherby in recent weeks. This broader net caught more than a few in its sweep, dredging up incidents that might otherwise have remained buried. Miss Marple, listening from her usual place of apparent detachment, noted how swiftly these discoveries took on a life of their own in conversation. By mid-morning, the village shop was alive with speculation about an argument between Mr. Weatherby and Harris the gardener over missing tools, though Harris himself swore the matter had been settled that afternoon. As Miss Marple passed through the lane behind the Weatherby house, she caught sight of Mrs. Weatherby speaking in low tones to Paul Whiting, Helena Pritchard's nephew. They stood close together near the side gate, their expressions grave. When Mrs. Weatherby noticed Miss Marple, she offered a quick, too bright smile before stepping back, while Paul tipped his hat and moved away. It was the kind of encounter that might mean nothing or everything, depending on what one already knew. Later, Miss Marple called upon Helena. ostensibly to return a book she had borrowed. The cottage was neat, but carried a faint, lingering scent of tobacco smoke unusual for Helena, who neither smoked nor allowed guests to do so indoors. Helena seemed distracted, and though she received Miss Marple politely, her conversation was curiously stilted. When the subject of the Weatherbys rose, she hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the mantelpiece before she said, "Lawrence was a man of strong attachments. He didn't let go easily." The remark hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, and Miss Marple, sensing its weight, did not press further. The evening brought another subtle shift. Simon Dunning was seen in animated conversation with Harris outside the Blue Hart Inn, their gestures sharp against the gathering dusk. Whatever was said ended abruptly when Mrs. Chudleigh emerged from the inn and passed by. Simon turned away, his shoulders tense, while Harris made his way off without a backward glance. Miss Marple, watching from across the street, was reminded of how easily a shared grievance or a shared fear could bind two people together. The next morning, the vicarage hosted its weekly sewing circle, though the air inside was far from tranquil. Mrs. Lorimer was holding forth about the torn photograph, insisting that a woman's pride was at the heart of the matter, while Mrs. Price countered with a theory involving debts and blackmail. Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers moving steadily through a length of pale wool, and allowed their words to flow around her. In the midst of this, Mrs. Carpenter let slip that she had once seen Mr. Weatherby dining in the next town, with a woman not his wife, years ago. Mind you, but it struck me at the time, the woman's description bore a resemblance to Helena. Though Mrs. Carpenter could not be certain, that small disclosure seemed to tighten the net of suspicion around Helena. Though Miss Marple found herself looking beyond the obvious, if the torn photograph had been taken in the same period, it might explain both its destruction and its peculiar reappearance. Yet there was still the question of the unknown man in the picture, the one whose smile did not quite reach his eyes. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the churchyard, where the gravel paths were slick from the earlier rain. There she encountered Paul Whiting again, standing by the light gate as though waiting for someone. When she greeted him, he returned it politely, but without warmth. "You've been in St. Aldred's before, I think," she remarked. He paused, then replied, "Once or twice, a long time ago." There was no elaboration, but something in his manner suggested he had not come then for casual social calls. By the time dusk fell, Miss Marple had gathered enough small observations to know that the heart of the matter lay not in the day of Mr. Weatherby's death, but in events from years earlier. Old quarrels, attachments that had soured, and a photograph that someone had tried to erase from existence. These were the roots, and the crime was merely the bitter fruit. As she sat by her fire that night, the steady click of her knitting needles keeping time with her thoughts, she was certain of one thing: someone in St. Aldred's was holding fast to a secret, not because it proved them innocent, but because it proved them guilty. And soon, whether by design or by the slow workings of human nature, that secret would slip into the open. Chapter 7. Another twist. In the morning of the fourth day, the village awoke to a new ripple of unease. The news came not from Inspector Graves, but from young Emma Croft, who worked part-time at the Blue Hart Inn, and whose enthusiasm for tidying had led her to an unexpected discovery. She had been sweeping the small cupboard under the stairs in the inn's parlor, when her broom caught against something lodged behind a crate of bottled ginger beer. It was an envelope creased, water-stained, and unmarked on the outside. Inside was a single photograph, torn in the same two places as the one shown at the Weatherby's garden party. But this time, the pieces were held together not with yellowing tape, but with a strip of fresh adhesive. The image was identical in setting to the earlier photograph. 3 figures in front of the country inn, but this copy showed the unknown man's face far more clearly. Emma, flushed with the thrill of her find, had brought it directly to Mrs. Price at the post office, who in turn carried it to Inspector Graves. Within an hour, the inspector was at the inn, asking pointed questions of the landlord and his staff. Miss Marple heard of it while selecting apples at the greengrocer's. The news whispered to her with the relish of one sharing a morsel too good to keep. She asked, in her mild way, whether the photograph had been in color or black and white, and was told it was the latter, old-fashioned, you know, the sort where everyone looks a little surprised to be standing still. That afternoon, the inspector showed the recovered photograph to Mrs. Weatherby. Those present later remarked on her reaction, a fleeting, almost imperceptible tightening of the mouth before she handed it back. Helena Pritchard's response, when shown the same image, was markedly different. She stared at it for several seconds, her face unreadable, then asked in a low voice where it had been found. Graves, perhaps sensing the value of her question, did not answer directly. By evening, word had reached even the most reclusive corners of St. Aldred's that the photograph thought missing or destroyed had turned up in a public place, and the speculation took on fresh energy. Some declared it proved a deliberate attempt to hide evidence, while others argued it might have been planted to mislead. Simon Dunning, cornered by the persistent regulars at the inn, denied ever having seen the picture before the garden party, but his denial only seemed to sharpen their interest. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned the matter over in her mind as she walked home in the fading light. The reappearance of the photograph did not surprise her. In her experience, objects with the power to unsettle seldom stayed buried. What intrigued her was the choice of hiding place. The cupboard under the stairs at the Blue Hart Inn was hardly secure, yet it was just out of easy reach, a place one might tuck something away in haste, intending to retrieve it later. That suggested not only proximity to the inn, but also a certain familiarity with its quieter corners. The next morning brought yet another development. Harris the gardener, whose manner had been increasingly evasive, was found in a heated argument with Paul Whiting near the churchyard. No one could say exactly what had been said, but Mrs. Chudla, who happened to be tending her father's grave nearby, reported hearing the words, "Not yours to decide, and she'll never tell." Both men left abruptly in opposite directions, their faces tight with anger. Miss Marple, hearing of this, was reminded of the way Harris had avoided direct answers about the greenhouse, and of Paul's uncharacteristic arrival so soon after the death. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet seat in the corner of the Blue Hart's parlor, her knitting spread on the table beside a pot of tea. She listened without seeming to, catching fragments of conversation between the landlord and a visiting tradesman. They spoke of how Mr. Weatherby had come to the inn several times in the weeks before his death, always asking after an old friend who had once lodged there. The tradesman did not know the name, but he remembered the landlord mentioning that the friend had left suddenly years ago, and not on good terms. By the time Miss Marple returned home, she felt the threads beginning to cross. The unknown man in the photograph, the abrupt departures, the concealed envelope. These were not stray details, but parts of a pattern. Still, she kept her conclusions to herself, for the truth was not yet complete. She knew the next move would not come from her, but from someone desperate enough to try and control the story before it slipped beyond their grasp. That evening, as the wind rose and the branches outside her window rattled like old bones, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, eyes on the fire. Somewhere in St. Aldred's, someone was deciding whether to speak or to act, and she, with her unassuming patience, was prepared for either. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Next day dawned pale and windless, the kind of morning when the air seemed to listen as much as the people did. The village had grown quieter in its speculation, but the silence was a taut one, as though each household was waiting for a signal to begin speaking again. Miss Marple, after a short stroll to the vicarage to deliver a basket of scones, returned home and settled herself at her small writing desk. She had decided, quite deliberately, that the time had come to provoke a reaction, nothing grand, merely the smallest tug on a particular thread to see how far it would unravel. Her plan began with an innocent enough errand. She made her way to the Blue Hart Inn just before the midday custom began to trickle in, carrying a small brown envelope. Inside was not the incriminating photograph. Of course she did not yet have possession of it, but a carefully trimmed scrap of an old postcard, its edges worn to mimic the photograph's age. She placed it gently on the table before her as she ordered tea, letting it rest there in full view as though she had quite forgotten its presence. It did not take long. Harris the gardener entered first, removing his cap and glancing idly around the room. His eyes fell on the envelope, and for a fraction of a second, his step faltered. He continued to the bar, but Miss Marple noticed the way his shoulders turned slightly, as though to keep the table in his peripheral vision. A few minutes later, Helena Pritchard arrived, her nephew at her side. Helena greeted Miss Marple politely, but her gaze flickered to the envelope and then away with studied indifference, the kind of reaction that only drew attention by trying to avoid it. Paul Whiting, however, allowed his eyes to linger a moment longer than necessary before he spoke in his cool, deliberate voice about the weather. Miss Marple responded with her usual mild cheer, never once acknowledging the envelope's significance. After a few minutes, she rose, leaving her knitting bag carefully arranged so that the envelope protruded slightly on the table. As she stepped toward the counter, it was only a short absence, but when she returned, she found the envelope had been nudged closer to the edge, as if someone had tested how easy it might be to take without being seen. She gathered her things without comment, the faintest smile in her eyes. The test had not been conclusive, but it had told her enough. That afternoon, Inspector Graves called on her, looking more drawn than usual. "We've had another statement," he said, taking the chair she offered. "A reliable one, this time, from the landlord of the Blue Hart. He says Mr. Weatherby had arranged to meet someone there on the afternoon of the garden party, a meeting that never took place. He thinks it was about that photograph." Miss Marple listened, nodding gently. "And does the landlord know who this someone was?" she asked. Graves hesitated. "He believes it was a man who hasn't been seen in St. Aldred's for years. Went by the name Frederick Hale." The name meant nothing to the inspector, but Miss Marple, recalling a story from decades past, felt the faint click of a piece fitting into place. She said nothing of her own test at the inn, nor of the small reactions she had observed. Instead, she asked the inspector whether he had considered that the photograph might not have been intended for destruction at all, that it might have been a warning, or even a reminder to someone in the village. Graves frowned at that, muttering that it was an angle he had not yet explored. That evening, as the last of the daylight faded, Miss Marple sat in her parlor knitting by the fire. The rhythmic movement of the needles helped her order her thoughts. She now believed that the key to the entire matter was not the moment of Mr. Weatherby's death, but what had been decided perhaps long ago that had finally caught up with him. The photograph was not simply a relic of the past. It was a lever, something that could be used to move another person to action, whether by fear, anger, or the desire to keep a secret safe. She was content to let the following day pass without direct action. The village needed time to settle after the small disturbance she had caused, and in that quiet, she trusted that the person she sought would betray themselves again. People, in her long experience, could not help it. The mind could guard words, but the body had its own language, and somewhere in the quiet lanes of St. Aldred's, the next wordless confession was already preparing to speak. The day after her quiet little performance at the Blue Hart, Miss Marple kept deliberately still. She did not go to the high street, nor did she call on anyone. Instead, She busied herself with the kind of gentle domestic occupations that were least likely to rouse curiosity: baking a light seed cake, polishing the brass warming pan in the hall, mending a pair of old lace gloves. It was not idleness. She was waiting. She knew the ripple she had set in motion could only be measured in the stillness that followed. People who believed they had narrowly avoided danger always betrayed themselves soon after, and the more they told themselves they had been clever, the quicker it happened. From her parlor window, she could see a sliver of the lane. It was mid-morning when Harris the gardener passed by, carrying an empty sack slung over his shoulder. He walked quickly, head down, and did not notice the faint net of cobweb clinging to the hem of his trousers. Miss Marple noticed it, and she wondered whether he realized how easily such a thread could speak of where one had been. At noon, she took a short walk toward the churchyard, moving with the slow pace of someone who had no errand more pressing. Then, admiring the chrysanthemums, she encountered Helena Pritchard at the light gate, her face pale under her hat. "You've been keeping to yourself, Miss Marple," Helena said with a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "One might almost think you were watching us," Miss Marple replied with cheerful innocence. "Oh, my dear, I am far too busy with my knitting to watch anybody." But Helena's look lingered, sharp for just a heartbeat before she turned away. That afternoon, Paul Whiting appeared at Miss Marple's door. He was polite as ever, but his voice held an undercurrent of inquiry. "I understand you were at the Blue Heart the other day. Caused quite a stir, they say." Miss Marple gave a little laugh, the kind that made it sound as though she found the very idea absurd. "A stir, dear me. I only went in for a cup of tea." Paul's gaze rested on her longer than necessary, as though weighing whether she might be playing a deeper game. By early evening, the air in the village had thickened again, not with talk, but with the sense of something moving behind the scenes. The Wetherby house was shuttered, its windows reflecting the gold of the setting sun, while the Blue Heart's sign creaked faintly in the rising wind. Miss Marple sat in her arbor, hands idle for once, watching the shadows lengthen across the lane. She thought of the reactions to her brown envelope, the subtle shifts of posture and glance, and how those told her more than any confession might. It was after dark when she heard footsteps pause outside her garden gate. They stayed for a moment, then moved on. The sound was soft, but the rhythm was deliberate, and Miss Marple was certain the walker had looked toward her window before leaving. She allowed herself a small smile. It was exactly the sort of thing a worried person might do: not knock, not speak, but simply reassure themselves she was still there, still the harmless old lady they wished she would be. The next morning, the stillness broke. Mrs. Price at the post office was in a flurry over a piece of gossip so fresh it was almost steaming. Something had been disturbed in the back storeroom of the Blue Heart during the night. Nothing was missing, the landlord claimed, but a small wooden box in which he kept odds and ends had been opened and left on the counter. No one could say who had been in there. Miss Marple listened, offering no opinion, but the image of that wooden box settled neatly into her mind alongside the torn photograph and the envelope she had displayed. In the afternoon, she walked to the vicarage for a short visit. The vicar's wife, bustling in the kitchen, mentioned without thinking that she had seen Harris near the Blue Heart early that morning. "Strange time for him to be about," she said, "though I suppose gardeners have their own errands." Miss Marple smiled politely, but inwardly she marked the connection. Harris again. Harris in the lane, Harris at the inn, Harris near the greenhouse on the day of the murder, and always Harris avoiding her eyes when the subject turned toward Mr. Wetherby. On her way home, she stopped briefly at Helena Pritchard's gate. Helena was in her garden, trimming a rose bush with more force than skill. "I wonder," Miss Marple said mildly, "if you remember where that photograph was taken. Such a quaint-looking inn." Helena's hands stilled for a moment before she replied, "Somewhere far from here." I can't recall the name. Her tone was light, but her voice was just a fraction too quick. And Miss Marple, who had long ago learned to listen to what people hurried past, filed it away. That night, the village was quiet, but it was a watchful quiet. Lights burned later than usual in several windows, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of rain to come. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting untouched, thinking of the photograph's strange journey from Mr. Weatherby's bureau to the table, at the garden party, from someone's pocket to the inn's stair cupboard, and finally into Inspector Graves's hands. She thought of the people who had touched it, those who had feared it, and those who had tried to place it out of reach. She knew, with the deep certainty that came from long years of observing human frailty, that the next step would come soon. The photograph had already flushed one person into action. Another, driven by the same blend of fear and resolve, would try next. And when they did, she would be ready not with accusations, but with the gentle, unyielding persistence that always seemed to lead people to tell her exactly what she needed to. No doubt outside, the wind rose, rattling the ivy against her window. Somewhere in the darkness, a door closed softly, followed by footsteps fading along the lane. Miss Marple sat perfectly still, listening, her face calm but her mind bright with quiet anticipation. The game she had set in motion was nearly played out, and soon the truth, like the dawn, would arrive whether anyone wanted it or not. Chapter 9. The quiet watch day after Miss Marple's small test at the Blue Heart passed with an almost deliberate calm, as though the village had agreed to conduct itself properly again. The post office queue moved with uncharacteristic efficiency. The vicar's wife confined her remarks to weather and church flowers, and even Mrs. Chudley's tongue seemed, for once, restrained. But beneath this surface neatness, Miss Marple sensed the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from people holding their breath. She knew that her subtle display with the brown envelope would have rippled through certain minds, stirring unease where they most wished for stillness. She took advantage of the fine weather to walk through the lanes, her pace slow enough to invite conversation. At the far end of Church Row, she encountered Harris the gardener trimming a hedge with more vigor than skill. He straightened when he saw her, offered a curt greeting, and returned to his work without the usual exchange about vegetables or pests. His movements were brisk, almost hurried, as if he wished to cut short both the hedge and their meeting. Miss Marple lingered just long enough to remark on the improvement of the roses near the vicarage. Watching the way his jaw tightened at the mentioned dot in the afternoon, she paid a call to Mrs. Weatherby, who received her in the drawing room with tea already poured. The curtains were half drawn, despite the bright day, giving the room an enclosed, slightly airless feeling. Mrs. Weatherby's manner was smooth, but her hands moved restlessly over the arm of her chair, twisting an embroidered handkerchief. They spoke of small matters until Miss Marple, quite casually, mentioned that she had been at the Blue Heart the previous day, and had overheard the landlord speaking about objects that turn up where they don't belong. The handkerchief stilled for a moment, then resumed its turning. Mrs. Weatherby smiled politely, but made no reply. Helena Pritchard was less guarded when Miss Marple encountered her later near the churchyard. She seemed preoccupied, answering questions without really hearing them. When Miss Marple remarked on the village's unusual quiet, Helena gave a short, dry laugh. "They're all waiting, you know, waiting to see who's next to speak out of turn." She glanced toward the Weatherby house before excusing herself and walking on, her pace quickening. Miss Marple stood for a moment watching her go, thinking that such an offhand remark was rarely made without reason. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Simon Dunning appeared at Miss Marple's door, his cap in his hands, and asked if he might speak with her. Inside, he perched on the edge of the chair, his voice low and urgent. "I think someone's trying to put it on me," he said. They've been asking questions about where I was, what I saw. But I didn't see anything, not really. Only that he wasn't alone before. Before it happened, he hesitated, glancing toward the window. I don't know who it was with him. Could have been anyone. But if I say that to Graves, he'll make it into something else. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her needles resting in her lap. When he left, she felt more certain that Simon's role was not central, though his knowledge limited as it was might still prove useful. The next morning, Miss Marple sat in the arbor at the edge of her garden, watching the lane in the unhurried manner of someone enjoying the fresh air. Paul Whiting passed by, deep in thought, carrying a slim leather case. A few minutes later, Harris followed in the same direction, his stride purposeful. Both men returned separately, each glancing toward her house in passing. She found it interesting that neither acknowledged her, as though preoccupied with matters they wished to keep separate from village eyes. By midday, the atmosphere had shifted again. Mrs. Price at the post office was whispering about something found in one of the sheds. Behind the Blue Heart, details were scarce, but the word paper was mentioned more than once. Miss Marple did not press for more. There was no need. If the discovery was relevant, it would come to her ears soon enough. She spent the rest of the day in her parlor, working steadily at her knitting while her thoughts sifted through what she had seen and heard in recent days. The photograph, the hurried concealments, the guarded looks. These were no longer loose threads, but strands beginning to weave into a single fabric. It was late in the evening when she drew her curtains and glanced once more toward the darkened street. Somewhere beyond the still houses and shuttered windows, she knew, the truth was edging closer to the surface, and when it came, it would not be announced with drama or confession. It would be something smaller, a pause too long, a word chosen too quickly, and she would be there to see it. Chapter 10. The revealed morning of the revelation began quietly, with the pale autumn light lying soft on the hedgerows, and the air cool enough to promise rain by evening. Inspector Graves had asked Miss Marple to join him at the Blue Hart Inn, saying only that there were a few matters to clear up. She arrived to find Mrs. Weatherby, Helena Pritchard, Paul Whiting, Simon Dunning, and Harris the gardener all assembled in the low-ceilinged parlor, the landlord hovering uneasily in the background. The torn photograph lay on the table between them, pieced together with its fresh strip of tape. Graves began briskly. "We've learned enough now to set this business straight. The photograph, as it turns out, shows Mr. Weatherby, Mrs. Pritchard, and one Frederick Hale, a man who left St. Aldred's some years ago under unfortunate circumstances." He glanced toward Miss Marple. "You've been saying from the start that the past was the key here. Perhaps you'll explain." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It was clear from the beginning," she said gently, "that the photograph had been both destroyed and preserved, twice torn, twice mended. That told me it was important to more than one person, and for different reasons. Mr. Weatherby kept it because it was leverage. Others wished it gone because it tied them to something best forgotten." She looked toward Helena. "In this case, an affair, one that ended badly when Frederick Hale vanished, leaving behind debts and the threat of exposure." Helena's hands tightened on her lap, but she said nothing. Miss Marple went on. "Recently, Mr. Weatherby came into possession of another copy of the photograph. He used it to pressure someone who feared not only the scandal, but also the fact that Hale's departure had been hastened." Her eyes moved to Harris. "You were the one who helped him leave, were you not? And you knew why he had to go?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, his face set. "I did what I was asked," he muttered. Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Mr. Weatherby summoned Simon Dunning to the greenhouse under the pretense of showing him a document. But before Simon arrived, he met with you, Harris. You tried to persuade him to give up the photograph. When he refused, you struck him, not intending to kill, but the fall on the gravel path did the rest. In panic, You removed the photograph and hid it at the inn, intending to retrieve it later. But by then, the search had begun. Graves leaned forward. And the involvement of Mrs. Weatherby? Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. She knew about her husband's hold over others and feared the consequences. When she found the torn photograph in the bureau after the party, she concealed it, thinking it would protect her household. She did not know there was another copy hidden at the inn. Paul Whiting cleared his throat, his expression one of reluctant understanding. "And my visit?" Miss Marple nodded. "You came to protect your aunt, believing she might be accused, but your very rival confirmed to me that there were ties in this village stronger than mere acquaintance and that some secrets, carried long enough, begin to bind their keepers together as tightly as guilt." There was a silence in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. Harris's shoulders slumped, and he stared at the worn boards beneath his boots. "It wasn't meant to happen like that," he said at last. "He was going to ruin her. I just wanted to stop him." Inspector Graves signaled to the constable at the door. Harris rose without resistance, and the two left together. The others remained seated, the atmosphere in the parlor shifting as if a tightly drawn cord had been cut. Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the village, the air felt lighter, though she knew it would be some time before the talk subsided. She paused at her garden gate, looking at the familiar curve of the lane, the chimneys smoking gently in the cool air. People would go on, as they always had, some grateful, some resentful, all relieved in their own way. That evening, with the fire crackling in her parlor, Miss Marple took up her knitting and reflected on the case. It had been, in the end, not a matter of evidence, but of human nature, of pride, fear, and the lengths to which people would go to keep the past from stepping into the present. She had seen it before, and she would see it again. And as always, it would be the smallest things, a flicker of the eyes, a hand tightening on a chair that told her where to look. In St. Aldred's, life would return to its measured pace, but somewhere behind its lace curtains and painted doors, the memory of a torn photograph would remain. Miss Marple, as ever, would remember it too, not for the scandal it concealed, but for the quiet way the truth had chosen to reveal itself.